The population of the world grew by 50% from 1900 to 1950 and then increased by 200% over the next 50 years to reach 6 billion just before the turn of the 21st century. Even with fertility declining and a slower rate of population growth in most countries, the United Nations predicts a global population of about 9 billion in 2050, eventually stabilizing at about 10 billion by the end of the century. These bare demographic facts reveal the absolutely amazing progress of humankind during the 20th century. The demographic change states that there is an evident improvement in the human condition in the past 2.5 centuries. The world's inhabitants face environmental and related challenges at national level and even at the international level due to the changes in the population size. Subject of demography or the population dynamics become significant as it has a direct impact on the society. The first real heyday for demography was probably in the 1960s and 1970s with the discovery of the global population problem. History of human growth and population. Modern human beings, Homo sapiens, are the most recent branch of the living species that emerged in Africa around 100,000 years ago. Language as a media for communication allowed human beings to accumulate and share knowledge and to continue coordinate group actions in order to collect and hunt for food more effectively than any other large animal. The ability to communicate through language allowed humans to rise to the top of the food chain and created the first population explosion or the great leap forward, with early humans spreading to all corners of the globe beginning around 50,000 to 60,000 years ago. Agricultural development. The next significant change in the population growth of human population happens as the response to agricultural development. The most consequential response to population pressure in prehistory was the domestication of plants and animals about 10,000 years ago. Although settled agricultural communities created the conditions for an expansion of population growth and the great civilizations of antiquity, the shift from migratory foragers to farmers was probably involuntary. Agricultural populations generally work longer hours and consume less than hunting and gathering populations. In agricultural societies, enduring oppression from the ruling class arises inevitably, which made the people work hard. Population pressures along with the Enlightenment led to the independent invention of agriculture in numerous places from around 8500 to 3000 BC, including Southwest Asia, China, New Guinea and multiple locations in America and Africa. For a few generations, agriculture can provide a safety valve for population growth. For the same unit of land, agricultural production can support a much denser population than hunting and foraging. Agriculture also changes the conditions affecting fertility and mortality dynamics, including the motivation for children. Fertility levels in hunting and gathering societies were lower than in agricultural population. Most pre-agricultural populations are migratory and the mothers had to carry small children for long distance. Since a woman could carry only a single child at a time, the optimal fertility pattern would be one with long interbirth intervals. Infanticide was a common cultural practice in such populations if one birth followed too soon after another. Agrarian settlements and higher level of fertility leads to incidence of mortality. This structural necessity was accompanied by a variety of economic and social incentives for high levels of childbearing at the household level. The children were considered as productive hands by watching over farm animals or doing routine chores in the agrarian society. An agricultural community absorbs and cleared the nearby lands and brought into production. From the origins of humankind around 100,000 years ago to the dawn of agriculture, the human population of the world increased to about 6 million. It included tens of thousands of hunting and gathering societies whose presence had spread to virtually all corners of Europe, Africa, Asia, Australia and America. As dependency of agriculture increases, human population densities also increases, which is directly proportionate in most regions. About 2/3 of this population lived in Asia, which includes the Middle East, China and South Asia. But there were about 30 million in Europe, 25 million in Africa and 12 million in America. The growth from 6 to 250 million over 10,000 years represents an average rate of less than 0.04% per year. Industrial development. The next major turning point in world demographic history is the Industrial Revolution, which is usually dated with its origin around 1750 AD. Industrialization as a process began in 18th century England and spread throughout the world over the next 2.5 centuries. Indeed, the full weight of the industrial and urban revolutions in Asia, Africa and Latin America is still in progress. The breathtaking changes in scientific knowledge, transportation and communications, economic productivity and the structure and role of governments have few precedents in human history. In turn, these social, economic and political changes have transformed the conditions under which the human communities live, with revolutionary consequences for health and well-being. Initially, the impact of human mortality was modest, with less frequent periods of crisis mortality in the 19th and early 20th centuries than in earlier eras. The major real gains in the life expectancy occurred in the 20th century, especially during the second half of the century. It is difficult to fully understand the enormity of the demographic consequences of the declines in the mortality as the world's population grew from 1 billion shortly after 1800 to 6 billion shortly before 2000. Changes in the social, economic and political arenas across the world and the diffusion of ideas to reduce mortality and morbidity had influenced the trends in population growth over the 20th century. In 1900, the greatest concentration of world's population was in Asia, double the size of Europe, where more than 900 million people lived, almost 6 in 10 of all humanity. The large Asian population reflects the legacy of history. Even in antiquity, the populations of China and India numbered in the tens of billions. Fertile river valleys, complex irrigation systems, extensive trading systems and strong states created agrarian civilizations with extensive peasant populations. Over the centuries, these civilizations expanded and contracted with accordion-like waves of demographic growth and decline. Asia had fallen behind the European economic and technological advances in the 18th and the 19th centuries, but Asian populations had overall continued to grow during this period. In the case of other developing countries, Africa, Latin America and North America, although thickly populated, did not have densely settlements as in Asia, nor the economic expansion as seen in Europe. After being virtually depopulated by European diseases and conquest, the American had been growing rapidly by migration and natural increase for several centuries, but only comprised less than 10% of world's population in 1900. Demographic trends. During the 20th century, there were two dominant demographic trends: unprecedented rates of population growth and a shifting of balance of world's population to the poorer regions of Africa, Latin America and Asia. Over this 150 years period, Asia will roughly hold its own with almost 60% of world's population. The African share will be triple from 7 to 21% and the Latin American proportion will double to 9%. Second trend is acceleration of population in the developed countries. The combined populations of Europe and Northern America were 30% of the world's population in 1900, 29% in 1950, 17% in 2000 and will be only 11% in 2050. Facts about the population trends. For most of the 20th century, the European population was growing at rate only half or 1/3 of that in other world regions. During the second half of the 20th century, Europe grew at 0.6% per annum, while Asia, Africa and Latin America grow at almost 2% per year or even higher. It is quite interesting that in 1900 the population of Africa was about 1/4 that of Europe. By 2000, the two regions had about the same demographic weight, and by 2050 Africa will be 3 times larger than Europe. The projected African population of 2 billion in 2050 will be considerably larger than the world's population in 1900. The population of Asia in 2000 is already twice the world's population a century earlier and even exceeds the world's 1950 population by 50%. Europe and other developed regions represent a smaller share of world's population. They are likely to be smaller in absolute terms. The United Nations medium projections based on rather conservative criteria predict that Europe will have 100 million fewer persons in 2050 than in 2000. The power of compound interest can lead to huge increase in population size in only a few decades. This power is a valuable trait when a society is recovering from a major demographic catastrophe, but it can lead to trouble in a world of fixed resources. How will the world be different with more persons from the poorer regions and less from the contemporary advanced countries? This is an important topic which has to be addressed in a sociological research. The fields of international and comparative sociology will become increasingly important as sociologists begin to address questions about the full range of contemporary and historical societies. The contemporary period of population growth is unique not only because of the huge numbers involved, but also the values of components of growth have changed. Historically, population growth occurred under conditions of high fertility and moderately high mortality. The mortality declines of the 20th century have no parallel in human history. Very low mortality and moderate levels of fertility have given rise to substantial population growth in the modern day society. Another important factor that influences the growth rate in recent dates is changing trend in life expectancy. Concept of population studies and demography. When a group of species belonging to the same category lives in a same geographical area is called population. Demography is considered to be a branch within the field of sociology. In sociology, population refers to the collection of human beings. It relies heavily on statistical data, collecting, interpreting and presenting the information to determine trends. Most of the data comes from the censuses around the world. Other survey and statistical records are also used to lesser degree. Demographers primarily handle information about basic life events like birth and death rates, migration, employment, divorce, contraceptive use, hunger, economics, access to running water, education, life expectancy and so on. These statistics are used in a few different ways. These information are used to plan for better future and avoid potential problems. Demographers also study the consequences and the effect of population trends on the environment. Population studies also plays a significant role in government's fund allocations and sharing of resources. The specific branch in sociology which studies the population is called demography or population studies. Demography is a social sciences that studies the size, composition and distribution of the human population of a given area at a specific point of time. Changes in population size and composition, the components of these changes, fertility, mortality and migration, the factors that affect these components and the consequences of changes in population size, composition and distribution or in the components themselves. To explain it shortly, demography is the systematic and scientific study of human population. The word demography comes from the Greek word demos for population and graphia for description or writing, thus it implies writing about populations. It is believed that the term demography was first used by Belgian statistician Achille Gillard in his book Elements of Human Statistics or Comparative Demography in the year 1855. Definition of demography. The concept of population is defined in as many ways as there are, and it may be classified broadly under 5 categories: statistical, demographic, genetic, social and ecological. Statisticians view population as comprised of all individuals possessing one or a few defined characteristics within a defined space. In demographic analysis, focus rests on demographic events like fertility, mortality and migration. As a multidisciplinary subject matter in the field of biology, genetics population is discussed as Mendelian population. It defines population as a group of individuals who reproduce sexually or are potentially capable of doing so, focuses on the evolutionary dimension and differs therefore fundamentally from other disciplines like general ecology or demography. In reality, a biological population has moving and preamble boundaries which are intimately linked with cultural and social factors. That is to say that the study of human populations widely exceeds the scope of biology alone, and the definition of population is by essence multiple. The discipline examines the size and composition of population as well as the movement of people from one locale to another. Demographers also analyze the effects of population growth and its control. Several demographic variables play central roles in the study of human populations, especially fertility and fecundity, mortality and life expectancy, and migration. John Grant is deemed by many to be the founder of demography. He was an Englishman who, although lacked any higher education and untrained in sciences or mathematics, published in 1662 the first known quantitative analysis of human population, natural and political observations made upon the bills of mortality. The field of demography includes the subjects which are discussed in the World Population Conferences since 1954. The two conferences of 1954 and 1965 discussed the following subjects: fertility, death rate, migration, genetic composition, future probabilities, population and means of subsistence, techniques of population measurement and the training of the demographers. Other subjects included in the scope of demography are distribution of population, qualitative aspect of demographic data, family planning, growth of population, demographic aspects of supply of labor, housing and the demographic aspects of saving and investment. The scope of demography has further increased after 1965. The computer techniques are the contribution of this decade. In the words of Peter Cox, computer techniques using simulation have been developed in order to stochastic variability can be provided for in various stages. This is a rapidly growing area of demography, and the prospects for future progress are almost as important as the work already done. We are all population actors. All human beings are population actors for the reason demography is the study of most important events in our lives, and we are very much involved in these events. Birth and the death of the individual are the occasions in which they were identified by name, and demographers are interested in studying these components. Other important occurrences in life are marriage and movement from one residence to another. Marital status and residential changes are significant areas of studies of demography. The real important events occur in the life of human being is the basis for the study of demography, and since each and every member of the society are the actor of the population. The major demographic trend of the 20th century was the rapid expansion of the world's population, fueled by unprecedented declines in the mortality in both developed and developing countries. In the last part of the 20th century, the global fertility transition spread to Asia, Latin America and Africa. Although demographic theories do not provide precise predictions of the threshold values of social conditions needed to affect demographic change, there is a general consensus on the factors that have shaped the modern demographic history. The growth of scientific knowledge and the accompanying changes in production, healthcare, and personal behavior has led to much lower levels of mortality. But these growths have contributed to several problems like massive malnutrition, pressures on non-renewable resources, and low standards of living in many countries. Declines in mortality and changes in the role of family have led to lower incentives for childbearing in modern societies. Stopping growth would not completely solve the problems related to population explosion, but it can make it easier to deal with them. Now, the importance of population change has become increasingly relevant in policy making at the regional, state, national, and international levels. Awareness among the people about the demographic trends has increased, and a systematic study of scientific discipline receives increased attention in the popular media in the recent decades because the world's population must stop growing because we inhabit in finite space.